Hey guys, welcome to Through the Bible Verse by Verse, a plain and simple study of the entire Bible, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse. We are in 1 Samuel chapter 20, and times are tough for David. The promises of God are not apparent to him. He was anointed king, but the king is doing everything in his power to destroy David. And they're just going to get worse and worse and worse. Now, we will not get into the kingship of David until we get to 2 Samuel. So the rest of the book is really David on the run, and then the ultimate destruction of Saul. And as we can see that Saul is deteriorating in his mind, his emotions. He's just, you would almost say he's insane, but this is a spiritual condition that is causing him great affliction, great torment, as he tries to deal with the fact that, and I think in some respect he knows he's losing the kingdom, that God is not going to keep the kingdom. And that means passing it on to his descendants as well. But yet he's fighting against God, trying to destroy God's anointed, God's choice. And that is the sad thing about Saul. But all right, let's get into it. And all right, here we go. First Samuel chapter 22. I'm sorry. So David left Gath and took refuge in the cave of Adullam. And when David's brothers and his father's whole family heard, they went down and joined him there. Now remember, he has 7 brothers, okay? And at this point too, it's become unsafe. Remember, 3 of his older brothers were serving in Saul's army. It's unsafe for them. They really don't know what Saul would do for them. He would not only try to kill, in other words, he's trying to destroy and kill everyone in David's orbit here. So David left Gath and took refuge in the cave of Adullam. And when David's brothers and his father's whole family heard, they went down and joined him there. In addition, every man who was desperate, in debt, or discontented rallied around him, and he became their leader. About 400 men were with him. Now, so when you keep this in mind, always know that the movement of 400 men is noticeable. I say that because you notice sometimes this is how you can kind of spot them. You can spot people. Also take note that, notice when he says people who are in debt, desperate, and discontented. So a lot of these people are not the best people at first. Okay, and later on we'll see some of that from them, but they're not the best, they're not the godliest people. Verse 3, from there David went to Mizpah of Moab, where he said to the king of Moab, please let my father and mother stay with you until I know what God would do for me. So he left them in the care of the king of Moab, excuse me, and they stayed with him the whole time David was in the stronghold. Now the term of stronghold here, meaning he was on the run, meaning he wasn't in a, you know, it's kind of a euphemism kind of statement here, the stronghold. We think of stronghold sometimes as a safe place, but it's actually David was on the run at this time. Verse 5, then the prophet Gad said to David, don't stay in the stronghold, leave and return to the land of Judah. So David left and went to the forest of Hereth. So Saul heard that David and his men had been discovered, and at that time Saul was in Gibeah, sitting under a tamarisk tree at the high place. His spear was in his hand. Now, if you kind of notice, we always see Saul with holding his spear, right? With his spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing around him. Saul said to the servants, "Listen, men of Benjamin, is Jesse's son going to give you all the fields and vineyards? Do you think he'll make you? Do you think he'll make all of you commanders and thousands? I'm sorry. Let me read this. I'm going to go back and read this again. Do you think he'll make all of you commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds? That is why all of you have conspired against me. Nobody tells me. When my own son makes a covenant with Jesse's son, none of you cares about me or tells me that my son has stirred up my own servants to wait in ambush for me, as in the case today." Now, of course, none of this is true. And I want to say it's kind of amazing because when I think about Saul, I think about our previous president. Okay? And some of the madness that in his antics and some of the things that he's saying here. So notice he says here now, hey, what is Jesse going to do for you? The reality is Jesse could do a lot. He's the Lord's anointed. Look at verse 9. He says, "Then Doeg, or Doeg the Edomite, who was in charge of Saul's servants, answered." Now remember him? He was there that day, and he saw David, and he saw him with the priests. "I saw Jesse's son come to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub at Nob. And Ahimelech inquired of the Lord for him, and gave him provisions. He also gave him a sword of the sword of Goliath the Philistine. And the king sent messengers in summer, Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and his father's whole family, who were the priests in Nob. All of them came to the king. And Saul said, 'Listen, son of Ahitub, I am at your service, my lord,' he said. Saul asked him, 'Why did you and Jesse's son conspire against me?' You gave him bread and sword and inquired of God for him, so he could rise up against me and wait in ambush as it is this day." Now, of course, this is simply not true. In Saul's mind, it might be true because he is now really bordering on dementia. I mean, and I'm saying it in a bad way, insanity, paranoia. His sinful condition, his rebellion against God, his rebellion against God has so deluded his mind. Verse 14, Ahimelech replied to the king, "Who among all your servants is as faithful as David? He is the king's son-in-law, captain of your bodyguard, and honors your house." Now that's the reality, though. And this, by the way, this is what everybody else saw. I'm so tempted to really kind of make the comparison of some of our politics today, but I won't. Verse 15. "Was today the first time I inquired of God for him? Of course not. Please, don't let the king make an accusation against your servant or any of my father's household, for your servants didn't have any idea about all of this." But the king says, "You will die, Ahimelech, you and all of your families, all of your father's whole family." Then the king ordered the guard standing by, "Turn and kill the priests of the Lord," because they sided with David. For they knew he was fleeing, but didn't tell me. But the king's servants would not lift a hand to execute the priests of the Lord. So now we see just how evil he has become, that he's executing the priests of the Lord. That the priests of the Lord no longer hold the esteem and the value they should hold. The counsel of God, the servants of God. And here Saul is saying, because you sided with David, which they didn't. But again, this is as bad as it gets for Saul. Verse 18. So the king said to Doeg, a dog, go and execute the priest. So Doeg the Edomite went and executed the priest, and on that day he killed 85 men who wore the linen ephod. He also struck down Nob, the city of the priests, with the sword, both men and women, children, infants, oxen, donkeys, and sheep. Now, what is interesting about this is the very thing that caused him to be rejected by God. He does this with no command from God, but notice he kills everything. Notice he doesn't keep the best sheep. Okay? But he's willing to kill because, according to him, they sided with David. This is as bad as it gets with Saul. Verse 20. However, one of the sons of Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, escaped. His name is Abiathar, and he fled to David. And Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord. David said to Abiathar, I knew that Doeg the Edomite was there that day, and that he would surely report it to Saul. I myself am responsible for the lives of everyone in your father's family. Stay with me. Don't be afraid. For the one who wants to take my life wants to take your life. You will be safe with me. In a sense, David is kind of wearing the guilt because he says, yeah, my actions caused your father and your family to be killed. Abiathar would go on to be the priest of the Lord, and we will see him later on. He will go on to be the priest under David's rulership. But he will have also a very interesting end, but we wait till we get there. But this is as bad as it gets for Saul, how evil he becomes, how evil he has shown himself to be. Okay? Verse 1, it was reported to David, look, the Philistines are fighting at Keilah and raiding the threshing floor. So David inquired of the Lord, should I launch an attack against the Philistines? And the Lord answered David, launch an attack against the Philistines and rescue Keilah. Now, this would be sort of David's MO, that he will inquire of the Lord. Unlike Saul, who took things upon himself. Notice David, we will see this as he will get into his kingship. This would be sort of his regular practice, seeking God and asking God for his wisdom and his guidance. Verse 3. But David's men said to him, look, we are afraid here in Judah. How much more if we go to Keilah against the Philistine forces? Once again, David inquired of the Lord, and the Lord answered him, go at once to Keilah, for I will hand the Philistines over to you. And David and his men went to Keilah and fought against the Philistines, drove the livestock away, and inflicted heavy losses on them. So David rescued the inhabitants of Keilah. Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, fled to David at Keilah, and he brought an ephod with him. When it was reported to Saul that David had gone to Keilah, he said, God has handed him over to me, for he has trapped himself by entering a town with barred gates. So Saul is again getting more and more deluded. God is on my side now, when God has expressly told Saul, I have rejected you. I want nothing to do with you, okay? Verse 8, then Saul summoned all the troops to go to war at Keilah and besiege David and his men. And when David learned that Saul was plotting evil against him, he said to Abiathar the priest, bring the ephod. And David said, Lord God of Israel, your servant has heard that Saul intends to come to Keilah and destroy the town because of me. Will the citizens of Keilah hand me over to them? Will Saul come down, as your servant has heard? The Lord of Israel, please tell your servant. The Lord answered, he will come down. Then David asked, will the citizens of Keilah hand me and my men over to Saul? They will, the Lord responded. So even though David saved them, notice God is telling them, yeah, they're going to hand you over. Verse 13. So David and his men, numbering about 600, so now he's added, remember he started off with 400 men, now he's added a couple hundred more, left Keilah at once and moved from place to place. And when it was reported to Saul that David had escaped from Keilah, he called off the expedition. David then stayed in the wilderness strongholds and in the hill country of the wilderness Ziph. Saul searched for him every day, but God did not hand David over to him. And this is something I think should be extremely, we should always know this, that behind the scenes, God is working on our behalf. Okay, even though Saul wanted to do evil, verse 15, David was in the wilderness of Ziph and Horesh when he saw that Saul had come out to take his life. Then Saul's son Jonathan came to David in Horesh and encouraged him in his faith in God, saying, excuse me, don't be afraid of my father. Saul will never lay a hand on you. You yourself will be king over Israel, and I'll be your second in command. Even my father Saul knows this. Now, there's a couple of things about this here. This is to me an example of how people, as we go through the Old Testament, should be. Recognizing God's decree, recognizing God's sovereignty. So Jonathan had every right to, I'm going to stop here and come back. Jonathan had every right to expect that he would be the king after his father. He had every right. He recognizes, though, that God's decree was better. He recognizes God's choice. And so he then says now, hey, you're going to be king. I know it. My father knows it. God has spoken. Now, what is sad, however, is the other statement when he says, I will be your second in command. This will not happen for Jonathan, and that is the sad news. What is good about Jonathan, of course, is that he recognizes what God's decree is, and then there's no jealousy. There's no saying, "Hey, I'm being robbed," but he understands God's will, and that's very, very noteworthy of Jonathan. What is sad is that he won't be the second in command. Verse 18: the two of them made a covenant in the Lord's presence. Afterwards, David remained in Horesh while Jonathan went home. Let me see here, verse 19. Let me see how much we got here. You know what? I'll go on and read it. I'm going to go over it just a little bit. Just a little bit. Alright, verse 19. Some Ziphites came up to Saul and Gibeonites and said, David is hiding among us in the stronghold at Horesh, on the hill of Hashilah, south of Jeshimon. Okay. Now, whatever the king wants to come down, let him come down. Our part would be to hand him over to the king. May you be blessed by the Lord, Saul replied, for you have taken pity on me. So again, just delusion, you be blessed. Well, God is not blessing you, Saul. Verse 22. Go and check again, investigate and watch carefully where he goes. And the one who sees him there, they tell me he's extremely cunning. So now this is kind of like he's playing slide. They tell you, he's cunning, or he's a shrewd military man. Anyway, verse 23, look and find out all the places where he hides. Then come back to me with accurate information, and I'll go down with you. If it turns out he's really in the region, I'll search for him among the clans of Judah. So they went to Ziph ahead of Saul. Now David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon in Arabah, south of Jeshimon, and Saul and his men went to look for him. And when David was told about it, he went down to the rock and stayed in the wilderness of Maon. And Saul heard of this and pursued David there. And Saul went along Saul went along one side of the mountain. David and his men went along the other side. Even though David was hurrying to get away from Saul, Saul and his men were closing in on David and his men to capture them. And the messengers came to Saul, saying, "Come quickly, because the Philistines have raided the land." So Saul broke off his pursuit of David and went to engage the Philistines. Therefore, that place was named the Rock of Separation. From there, David went up and stayed in the stronghold of Agidi. Now, what is interesting about this was that, notice, as Saul was closing in, God brought something that diverted their attention. They had to go and attend to the Philistines' attack. So again, you see God preserving David, even though, again, Saul almost had him. And the sad thing is, remember that Saul will never learn this lesson to the day of his death. That he will never ever learn that you can't fight against God. But in his sinful nature, he rebelled against God every time. And so now we're going to see how God, again, preserves David. So you can always rest assured knowing that if God has called you to whatever God's called you to, he will preserve you in that. All right, guys, chapter 24 in the next study. I'll see you then.